How the US dollar became the world's hidden financial empire, and how countries like Iran reveal the real power behind oil, sanctions, inflation, and global money systems. The US dollar controls global finance because the world economy was built around it through oil, trade, debt, and banking systems. Geopolitical tensions involving Iran and the Middle East expose how deeply money and power are connected. America printed trillions of dollars, and somehow your groceries became more expensive. One conflict involving Iran can affect your fuel prices, inflation, stock market, and even your salary. The world economy runs on oil, and oil runs on dollars. That's where the trap begins. America owes over $30 trillion. It keeps printing money. Its debt keeps growing. And somehow, the US dollar is still the most powerful currency on Earth, which honestly makes no sense at first. Because if your friend behaved like this financially, you'd hide your wallet immediately. But countries still trust the dollar with a global trade, oil markets, international debt, foreign reserves, banking systems. And that created something terrifyingly powerful. A system where America's interest rates affect your rent, US inflation affects your grocery bill, and one conflict involving Iran can suddenly increase fuel prices worldwide. Yeah, that's the weird part. Most people think geopolitics is just politicians yelling, military news, maps on TV. But geopolitics quietly controls inflation, oil prices, stock markets, currencies, jobs, investments. And at the center of that system is the US dollar. The dollar isn't just currency anymore. It's infrastructure, it's leverage, it's power disguised as paper. And countries like Iran reveal exactly how powerful that system really is. Because once oil became tied to dollars, the entire world became dependent on America's financial system whether they liked it or not. And now, escaping that system is incredibly difficult, like trying to uninstall capitalism from Earth using weak Wi-Fi. So today, we're breaking down how the dollar took over, why oil matters so much, how Iran fits into the story, why sanctions are terrifying, and how all of this secretly affects your life. Because once you understand how money really works, you stop seeing world events as random chaos. You start seeing incentives, and money always follows incentives. But here's the craziest part. The US dollar became powerful almost accidentally. After World War II, the entire world basically looked around and said, okay, everyone else is financially destroyed. America, congratulations, you're the adult now. And from that moment, the dollar slowly became the global reserve currency, the default trade currency, the center of global banking, and eventually, America's greatest geopolitical weapon. Not missiles, not tanks, money. And once oil got connected to dollars through the Middle East, especially regions involving Iran and Gulf oil routes, the system became almost impossible to escape. Because now countries didn't just want dollars, they needed dollars. And that changed global finance forever. How the dollar took over the world. The dollar became global king because the rest of the world was financially exhausted. To understand why the dollar controls the world, we need to go back to World War II. Europe was devastated. Britain was financially broken. Entire economies collapsed. Cities were destroyed. Infrastructure was gone. Meanwhile, America came out looking like the only student who somehow finished the group project early. The US had factories, military strength, stable banks, massive industrial output, and most importantly, gold. A lot of gold. So in 1944, world leaders met in Bretton Woods to redesign the global financial system. And they made a huge decision. The US dollar would become the center of global trade. And every dollar would be backed by gold. Meaning countries trusted the dollar because theoretically, you could exchange dollars for actual gold anytime. At the time, this system worked beautifully. America was stable, its economy was strong, and countries needed a reliable currency after the chaos of war. So nations began storing dollars instead of gold directly. Slowly, The dollar became the world's reserve currency, which sounds boring, but it changed everything because now trade happened in dollars. Reserves were held in dollars. International banking depended on dollars. And this gave America something incredibly powerful: global demand for its currency. Imagine if the entire world constantly needed your money to function. That's basically what happened. America could now borrow more easily, influence global finance, spend aggressively, and grow faster. But here's where things got dangerous. The US started printing more dollars than it had gold backing, which sounds smart, until reality arrives wearing math. Countries began noticing the imbalance, especially France. France basically looked at America and said, "This financial math feels emotionally illegal." And once countries started demanding gold instead of paper dollars, America had a problem. Too many dollars, not enough gold. And this is where one of the biggest financial plot twists in history happened. When money stopped being real, then America removed gold backing and somehow became even stronger. In 1971, President Nixon made a decision that changed money forever. He ended the gold standard completely, meaning the US dollar was no longer backed by gold at all. Now, logically, this should have destroyed trust instantly, because suddenly money became valuable mainly because people believed it was valuable. Which honestly sounds fake, because it kind of is. But instead of collapsing, the dollar became even more powerful. Why? Because America found something more important than gold: oil. This is where the Middle East becomes extremely important, especially countries near major oil routes: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Gulf nations. Oil wasn't optional. Oil powered factories, transportation, shipping, airlines, food systems, electricity. Basically, modern civilization runs on spicy dinosaur juice. And America realized something genius. If global oil was traded in dollars, then every country would need dollars permanently. So America made strategic deals with major oil producers. The deal was simple. Oil gets sold in US dollars. America provides military protection and support. This created the petrodollar system. And once this happened, the world became financially dependent on dollars. Even countries that disliked America still needed dollars to buy energy. That's the trap. And this is why conflicts involving Iran matter globally. Iran sits near the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil routes on Earth. A massive amount of global oil passes through that tiny area. Tensions involving Iran and the Strait regularly trigger fears of supply disruptions and higher energy prices globally. So whenever tensions rise, oil prices jump. Inflation fears increase. Markets panic. Investors rush toward dollars, meaning geopolitical fear actually strengthens dollar demand sometimes. Yeah, the system is weird. Your grocery prices are spiritually connected to Middle East diplomacy. How Iran exposes the system. Mini hook. Iran became one of the clearest examples of how dollar power works. Script. Iran has enormous oil reserves, and oil means influence. But Iran also became one of the biggest examples of how the dollar system can become a geopolitical weapon, because the global economy runs heavily through dollar-based systems, especially international banking, oil trade, cross-border payments, and America controls enormous influence over those systems. Over the years, the US placed major sanctions on Iran. Sanctions sound boring, but they're basically economic pressure wearing a business suit. These sanctions targeted Iranian banks, oil exports, global transactions, financial access, and because the dollar dominates global banking, America had leverage over international trade itself. If a country loses access to dollar systems, things get painful very quickly. Trade becomes harder. Foreign investment disappears. Banks avoid transactions. Businesses panic. Iran experienced inflation, currency weakness, restricted trade, economic isolation. And this revealed something important to the world. The dollar isn't just currency anymore. It's geopolitical infrastructure. And countries noticed. especially China, Russia, BRICS nations. Because if America can financially isolate one country, others fear they could be next someday too. That's why many countries are now trying to reduce dependence on the dollar system, slowly, carefully. But escaping is difficult because the entire global economy was designed around dollars. And Iran shows exactly how powerful that system can become. Recent tensions involving Iran and the Strait of Hormuz again triggered fears of major oil supply disruptions and rising energy costs globally. Analysts warned that escalation could severely impact oil markets and inflation worldwide. That's the terrifying part. One geopolitical hotspot can influence fuel prices in India, inflation in Europe, airline costs in Asia, stock markets in America. Wars don't just move armies anymore, they move markets. Visual suggestions, Iran sanctions graphics, Swift banking animations, oil routes map, red market crash visuals, mascot reactions, Leaf money banker villain mode, nervous watching oil chart explode, confused. Why does one water route control everything? The Fed controls global money flows. One American interest rate decision can financially punch half the planet. Now let's talk about the Federal Reserve. The Fed is America's central bank. Its main job is controlling inflation, interest rates, money supply, financial stability. Sounds local, right? Wrong. Because the dollar dominates global finance, the Fed indirectly affects almost every economy on Earth. And this is where things get weird. When the Fed raises interest rates, global money starts moving toward America. Why? Because investors love safety. If U.S. interest rates rise, U.S. bonds become attractive. Investors pull money from emerging markets. Currencies weaken elsewhere. Stock markets panic globally. This is why Indian markets sometimes crash, because an American economist in a gray suit said, "Inflation remains sticky." That one sentence can wipe billions from markets globally, which honestly feels rude. And this creates a strange reality. America exports financial pressure worldwide. When the Fed printed trillions during crises, global liquidity exploded. Stock markets soared. Crypto exploded. Asset prices went insane. But when the Fed later raised rates aggressively to fight inflation, everything reversed. Markets crashed. Startups struggled. Currencies weakened. Debt became expensive. And countries with large dollar debts suffered badly. Because many nations borrow in dollars. That's the trap. If your currency weakens against the dollar, repaying debt becomes more painful. Imagine owing money in a currency you cannot print yourself. Emotionally terrifying. And this is one reason countries like Iran, Russia, and China are interested in reducing dollar dependency. Because whoever controls global liquidity controls enormous influence. That's why Fed decisions matter even if you've never been to America. Your SIP returns, stock portfolio, EMI rates, crypto investments, even startup jobs can all react to the dollar system. The global economy isn't independent anymore. It's deeply interconnected. And the dollar sits at the center like, surprise, everything routes through me. Why countries are trying to escape the dollar. The world depends on the dollar, but many countries secretly want out. Now here's the important question. If the dollar system gives America so much power, why don't countries just stop using it? Simple answer, because replacing the dollar is incredibly difficult. The dollar dominates because of trust, liquidity, trade infrastructure, global banking systems, military confidence, network effects. Everyone already uses it, which makes everyone keep using it, like WhatsApp or Excel, or that one friend who somehow organizes every group trip because nobody else can function. But recently, more countries started worrying about dollar dependence, especially after sanctions involving Iran, Russia, geopolitical conflicts, because these situations showed something dangerous. The dollar system can become a weapon, and nobody likes depending completely on a system controlled by another country. So nations started exploring alternatives. China began increasing yuan-based trade. Russia shifted parts of trade away from dollars. BRICS countries discussed alternative payment systems. Some oil deals now happen outside dollar systems entirely. Even Iran worked with countries willing to bypass traditional dollar routes. This process is called de-dollarization, which sounds like a finance villain trying to defeat capitalism using PowerPoint presentations. But here's the problem. Replacing the dollar requires more than complaints. You need stable institutions, trusted financial systems, global confidence, strong legal systems, massive liquidity. And right now, no country fully matches America's financial infrastructure. China is powerful economically, but global investors still worry about transparency, government control, financial openness. So while alternatives are growing, the dollar still dominates globally. And ironically, during global crises, investors often rush into dollars for safety, even when America caused some of the chaos. That's the funniest part. The system survives because people still trust it more than the alternatives, which means the dollar remains powerful not just because of America, but because the entire world is already deeply connected to it, like financial Wi-Fi nobody can disconnect from. How this system secretly affects your life. You may not care about geopolitics, but geopolitics definitely cares about your wallet. Now you might be thinking, a cool story, leaf money. But how does this affect me personally? Oh, constantly. That's the scary part. Most people think global finance is some distant Wall Street problem. Meanwhile, geopolitics is quietly influencing fuel prices, groceries, rent, jobs, investments, loan rates, salaries. Let's start with oil. When tensions involving Iran rise, oil markets get nervous because Iran sits near the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important oil routes. If supply fears increase, oil prices rise. Transportation becomes expensive. Shipping costs increase. Inflation spreads globally. And suddenly, your food delivery costs more. Your Uber costs more. Airline tickets become painful. Even manufacturing costs rise, which eventually affects product prices too. That's how geopolitics enters your wallet quietly. Then there's the dollar itself. If the dollar strengthens, imported goods become expensive. Weaker currencies struggle. Foreign education costs rise. Travel becomes costlier for countries like India that import large amounts of oil. This matters a lot because expensive oil plus strong dollar equals inflation pressure. And inflation is brutal psychologically. Your salary may increase, but your purchasing power quietly weakens, which is basically, congratulations, you got poorer with extra steps. Then there's investing. Global investors react constantly to Fed decisions, sanctions, wars, oil prices, trade tensions. So stock markets move emotionally all the time. That's why understanding geopolitics makes you a calmer investor, because headlines stop feeling random. You begin seeing patterns, incentives, systems. And once you understand that, you stop reacting emotionally to every scary news cycle. Because the modern economy isn't just about money anymore, it's about power. And money follows power very closely. The future. Can the dollar lose its power? Every empire thinks it'll last forever. History usually disagrees. Now comes the biggest question. Will the dollar dominate forever? Maybe, maybe not. History says reserve currencies eventually change. Before the dollar, Britain's pound dominated global trade. Before that, other empires controlled global finance too. No system lasts forever. But replacing the dollar is incredibly difficult because global systems are deeply interconnected. Trade, oil, debt, banking, investments, international reserves. Everything was built around dollar infrastructure for decades. So even countries that dislike America still rely on the system heavily. But cracks are starting to appear. Countries are slowly exploring local currency trade, digital payment systems, alternative reserve assets, reduced dollar exposure. China wants greater yuan influence. BRICS countries discuss independent financial systems. Some countries increasingly buy gold again. Even digital currencies and CBDCs are entering conversations about the future of money. And geopolitical tensions accelerate these discussions, especially after sanctions on Iran, Russia conflicts, trade wars, financial restrictions. Because countries realize something important. If one country controls the financial operating system, that country has enormous geopolitical leverage, and nobody likes being dependent forever. But here's the reality. The dollar still dominates because markets trust it. Institutions remain strong. Liquidity is unmatched. Global investors still see America as relatively stable, which means replacing it fully could take decades, not years. And during uncertainty, people still rush toward dollars, even when they complain about the system, which honestly feels like, I hate this app. But unfortunately, it still works. So the future may become more multipolar financially, more diversified, less dependent on one currency alone. But for now, the dollar remains the closest thing the world has to a global financial emperor. And understanding that changes how you see inflation, investing, wars, markets, and even your own money. Because once you understand the system, you stop being surprised by it. Payoff. The US dollar controls the world because the world built itself around it. Trade, oil, debt, banking, trust. And once a system becomes global infrastructure, escaping it becomes incredibly difficult. Countries like Iran reveal how powerful that system can become during conflict, because modern geopolitics isn't just about armies anymore. It's about currencies, sanctions, trade routes, oil, banking access, and financial leverage. That's the real game now. The dollar isn't powerful because America simply says so. It's powerful because the world still depends on it every single day. And maybe someday, another system replaces it. Maybe the future becomes more divided, more digital, more decentralized. But for now, most countries are still playing inside America's financial operating system, whether they like it or not. And once you understand that, financial news stops looking random. You start seeing incentives, patterns, systems, power structures. And that's where real financial intelligence begins.